Alright, it's time to weather this Warhammer 40K Space Marine Primaris Impulsor. Hey, I'm John from Bius Scale Models. Thanks for joining me for this video. In the previous video in this series, I'd gotten this Impulsor painted up, all the detailing done, and some decals on. And so this one is going to be all about getting this guy weathered up. I'm going to start off by adding chips to the model, and for this I've decided to go with the brush typed rather than a sponge chip. Now I'm going to be going for a more refined level of chipping, meaning not necessarily I'm not going to put a lot, but I want them to be a little finer and a little more spaced than I can get with a sponge. I'm going to be trying to replicate a method that I've seen Martin on Night Shift scale models use on his armor. Now, I'm not the master of it that he is, but it's what's inspired it. Now, the color that I'm using, I wanted to go with the moot green, but at the same time, I didn't want it to be as bright as the moot green so that it would be distinct from the edge highlighting and appears chipping. So what I'm using is a mix of moot green and some Vallejo sky gray, and then I thinned it down with some airbrush flow improver and just a little bit of Liquitex flow aid. And that's going to give me a nice thin paint to apply, which allows this style of chipping to work very well. The paint flows off the brush easily and leaves just little bitty marks. It's going to be very desaturated looking, so that's going to keep it distinct, like I said. But it does take a while, but I think it looks really good. When I'm chipping a model, one thing I try to do is start at the lower part, and that's going to represent the most extreme level of chipping, and then that becomes kind of a reference for how I want the rest of the model to look. In fact, the way I'm going to work this is I'm going to start chipping here and then chip a little heavier down here and then lighter up here, and I'll use this portion right here as kind of my reference for the rest of the model. You can see here that I've added some larger chips. I've joined some of the small dots together to make a larger chip. I added a few streaking chips to represent scratches as things go by, and you can also do some vertically, or like where the crew may climb on and off, there's going to be some chips. But this is the process I'm going to go through on the rest of the model. This took about 5-6 minutes off camera time to do, so you can tell it's going to take a while to do this on the whole model. But I'm going to continue doing this across the rest of the model, and on the black areas I'm just going to use the sky gray for chipping that. One thing I like to do that I want to show real quick while I'm just getting into this is with decals, I often like to do some chipping with the edge of my knife and just scrape those just a little bit to represent, well, it doesn't represent chipping, it is chipping. That's why when, I think it was in the previous episode when I was applying the decal and I caused that little bit of damage there by using my knife to apply them, I said I wasn't really too worried about it because I knew I would be doing this. But just lightly chipping away with your knife and removing some of that decal will give them an authentic chipped look, because again, it's authentic chips. Then I can go back in later and develop more chipping color with the light gray. But if you think about it, this is painted over the black, so the first thing that's going to chip away when the white chips away is it's going to show the black color. With the first level of chipping done, I'm going to go in and use some Vallejo chocolate brown, and what this is going to do is simulate chips that have gone through the paint down to the underlying material. Now I'm imagining this underlying material to be ferrous in nature, meaning it can rust, because I'm going to want to go in and add some rust tones. So I'm just going to paint the inside of some of these light green chips with this paint. Now, if you wanted to make it as if it were a composite material, you could use a dark gray or something like that. You can use any color you want, really. But that's what this is going to represent, because I'm going to go back later and start adding in some rust tones in a few areas. Now, you can do this. You can make completely independent chips that don't have to have the light green around them, but this is the logic I'm going to follow. And I'm not doing it to represent a 3D effect. Sometimes you'll see, like with this streak, you'll see that somebody will do they'll do the dark color along the top of that line, and the lower color is supposed to represent where the light is reflecting from a gouge. I'm not going to be following that logic. I'm going to be doing it, and there's nothing wrong with that logic, but just for this one, I'm just going to be doing it in the interior of the chips rather than as a 3D effect. Like I said, just to start establishing where the rust tones are going to go. You don't have to do it in all of them. I like to do it in just the larger ones. I want to start adding in some rust, so I'm going to use about a 50-50 mix of this light rust and orange fire. The orange fire is from Vallejo, it's Game Air, and the light rust is Model Air from Vallejo. I've thinned this down with some Lamian medium from Citadel. It's basically paint without pigment. It's matte so that when I put this stuff on, it won't dry glossy, because the Model Air stuff, in the way I'm using this, sometimes will come out a little glossy. But what I'm going to do is just around bolt detail and stuff like that, just put in some suggestions of rusting and rust streaks. Whoops, sorry about bumping the camera. And things like that. Now, this stuff will go on a bit more opaque than it will actually dry. So if you've never used something like this before, thinned this way, when you first apply it, just take a look at how it dries and then decide, do you want to add more paint to the mix, or do you want to just add another coat, or how do you want to handle it? I like it being fairly transparent so that I can kind of control how things go on. But you can also put it around areas that have been chipped to suggest that those areas have started rusting, and kind of let it bleed outside of the brown area a little bit, and it'll sell rusting a little better. You can even streak down from some of these areas, just a light streak like that, and that'll begin to sell the notion of rust. So I'm going to continue doing this. Obviously it's going to take a little while, and we'll move on from there. All right, you can see how that rust now looks on top of the chipping, and I'm happy with that. I did some areas heavier than others. Remember, rust, what it represents is age, and what folks who play 40K tell me is that these vehicles are very, very old. So putting some things on to sell the notion of age really helps. I finished the rust around the whole vehicle, so I'm happy with how that looks. Certainly if you wanted to use oils or enamels, you could get a more refined look to it, but I'm just in the mood to use acrylics and not wait for the oils and enamels to dry. Now the next thing I want to do is start adding in some fluid kind of leaks, leaks from oil, fuel, hydraulic fluid, that kind of thing. Now to start off, I've got in my palette here a mix of 2 parts Agrax Earthshade and 1 part Nuln Oil, and then I thinned it down with some Lamian medium and a little bit of airbrush flow improver. There's no real right mix. I just kind of thin it down until I can see how it flows, and when I see it flowing down the side, when I put a pretty good blob up there, then I know I've got it how I want it. I do kind of like the rust And I just start applying it in areas that I think might have some kind of stains going on. Now it's fairly transparent, which is by design, because I want it to be, I want it to dry very transparent so that I can have the option of building up color if I want. And then I just go around and I look for areas that I think might have some kind of fluid leaks going on. Some of them I do streaks like that. And others I just kind of plug in a whole bunch of it, like around this. You know, we'll think that this has some kind of fluid leak going on, so I'll make it a little heavier around here. Now this will dry. It looks glossy now, but it will dry matte. Now you don't have to use Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. You could do something that has a little more red to it, a little more brown to it, a little more black to it, to represent different stains. Green fluid stains can always be kind of interesting. So I'm just going to go around, and wherever I think it needs a stain, I'm going to put it on there. Once it dries, I'll see how it looks, and then, you know, maybe add some more to it. But it's a simple way, quick way of adding some really fast drying fluid stains. Whenever I'm adding stains, one thing I often like to do is just pick an area that maybe there's no necessary a reason for a stain being there. Maybe somebody spilled some oil, a dude dropped his coffee, you know, whatever. When you're working on vehicles, there can be all sorts of stains that aren't necessarily explained by a leak right where something's at, or you know, any other thing like that. So every now and then think about throwing in a stain around the model that really has no explanation. It looks kind of cool in my opinion, and it also invites the viewer, I guess you'd say, to kind of, if they're being thoughtful about it, to kind of think, okay, I wonder what caused that, and maybe make up their own story for it. I like to do that sometimes when I'm really deeply invested in looking at someone's work, is just to think, okay, what would cause that? If there's no apparent explanation, what would cause that? Why is that there? And it's just kind of a fun thing to do. So anyway, just throwing in some dots here and there of color just to represent some kind of stain that happened at some time will help add to the depth of finish on your model. Something else that can yield some interesting effects is if you get some just plain water and wet an area where you want to represent some kind of fluid flow, like this. I'm just going to wet it all the way down the side of the model. Just put plenty of water on there. Got it just sloshing in water. I'm going to go in and I'm going to get my brush, and I'm just going to put in some of this along here to represent a really heavy stain. And then I'm just going to add more water and add more stain and just kind of let it flow through that. See where it goes. See what it does. And just see what happens. Yeah, it's slightly out of control, and I may have to go back in and kind of build it up a little bit later. You never know how randomness is going to look, but I find it fun to add stuff like that. If you're familiar with American football, this is an example of what is called an audible. I'd originally painted this imagining it to be an ID beacon. I'd had it kind of a glowy green look. But as I was putting on these fuel stains, I thought, you know what? I think I want to make that into a fuel filler cap. So I painted it red. And now I'm going to take my fuel stain mixture, and I'm just going to go in and I'm going to stain this guy up pretty heavily. Now I point this out just to point out There's nothing about any model build that has to be set in stone. You can be halfway through something, 2/3 through something, or even getting close to the end and decide, you know what? I think this thing is this. And make it so. It's part of the fun of modeling. There. ID beacon to fuel cap. 2 minutes. I'm going to start adding some earth and environmental effects. First thing I want to do is something to simulate rain streaking. For that, I'm going to use this Vallejo Model Wash Gray. Now, application of this is pretty simple. I get some in my palette. You have to stir it quite frequently because it does settle out very fast. I'm just going to get some on a liner brush. I'm just going to go in and flick that down like that. Now this stuff dries very transparent, so you get the opportunity to put on as little or as much as you want and get as much of a dramatic effect or as little an effect as you want. The reason I'm using this gray, they have a lot of other colors available. The reason I'm using this gray is it doesn't do much to the underlying color other than desaturate it a bit. But that desaturation is what makes the marks look like they're something. So, you know, it may be rain, it may be very light dust that is caked on, whatever, you know, the viewer thinks it is what it is. But I just put on several layers of it and let it dry so that it just kind of builds up the depth of the finish to sell the notion that this thing's been outside a lot. For the horizontal surfaces, I'm just going to lightly flick some on like this. You can do this as heavy or as light as you want. You can thin the wash down, try it at a thinner consistency, whatever you think is going to work. I'm going to add in some lighter streaking with this Vallejo Model Wash Dark Yellow. And by lighter, I mean I'm going to be more controlled about the application of it. I'm not going to, when I was doing the gray, I just kind of did it, I suppose you'd say, willy-nilly. This, I want to be a little more deliberate about bringing the streaks down from different elements like this and be much more precise about the placement. Now you can still go in and flick some on like that just for some general streaks, but I want these to represent streaks that have picked up some sort of color, because that yellow is going to give a little more of a tonal shift, of color shift, than the gray will. The gray is just going to desaturate it and look just generally streaky. This is going to be a little more specifically streaky. So just put these wherever you think it will look like it needs to be streaked. Now I'm getting closer to the point that I'm going to glue on those floaty plates. But before I do that, because they're going to need to be weathered also with some earth effects and things. But before I do that, I'm going to get the area underneath them, some of this European dust model wash. And the application for that is going to be a little different than the streaks. I'm essentially going to just, in these lower areas, just paint it on. Those areas are going to get dirty, you know, dusty, that kind of thing. So I'm just going to dab it on there. If I'm not covering it 100%, I'm not going to worry too much about it. But I do want to get more than not. And then as I get a little further up the side of the model, I'm just going to dab it in like that. And again, you're just looking to simulate, or I'm looking to simulate, just looking to simulate dust and dirt that will accumulate underneath there. I'm not going to go for mud because while it's reasonable to think that this thing could get muddy, I think it would just be a little too much with the floaty plates that are going to go on it, because I'm going to want those to remain kind of silver looking, to stay in universe a little bit, in canon, and I don't want to cover them in mud, so I will cover them in some of this wash. I'll put some of this wash on them, But I want the silver to show through, and I don't want it to look like necessarily a muddy tank, but maybe something that can float high enough that it stays mostly out of the mud, but definitely dust and dirt will swirl up on it. For the soot effects for the exhaust nozzles, the jet nozzles, the exhausts, and the guns, I'm going to use this Tamiya weathering powder. I'm going to use the soot color, which is really just kind of a really dark gray. And I like to apply this with a cotton bud. And I'm just going to get it and apply that on there like that and just kind of smear it around until I get an appropriate sooty look. All right, it's time to glue on the floaty plates. All right, the floaty plates are on, so I'm going to go in and just add some of this brown wash that I've been using earlier because I want them to look dirty too. Now, when I do this, I'm going to let this dry, and then I'm going to be sure and get on the other side, on the back side of them too, because that will be visible. So I need to do that. And one note, when you're putting these plates on, make sure you keep track of which ones go where, because a lot of them look alike, but there are some subtle differences, mainly having to do with the size of these upper plates. The ones that go on the side have the small plates. The ones that go on the front have the large plates like this. So keep that in mind, because if you're not careful, you can glue it in the wrong place. Ask me how I know this. You can see the floaty platey things now have just a tinge of brown to them to give them some look of being dirty. Not overly so, but just giving it that look. So it's getting pretty complete now. I've added a few more parts. I've added the gun on, the big gun pack up here. I still need to add the barrels. I'm kind of doing this progressively as I go along. But one detail I wanted to hit real quick was they've got these tubes that are here, one on either side. Now, I don't know what they represent, but the box art shows them as black. Now what I'm going to do is use some of this contrast Pterodon turquoise. I want it to be something a little different than just plain old black. So I'm just going to, I've got a little bit on my palette here off camera, and I'm just going to water it down just slightly with a bit of water and just paint that on there. When you're using contrast paints, you want to give them a good coat. They work better if applied fairly heavily, and you want to get them completely on before it starts drying, or you'll get lines and other things. So let me get that on there. I just want this to look like it's maybe suggesting a slightly glowy tube or something like that. So let me get that painted on there. All right, that's painted and dry, and I like the look that it gives. It's subtle, but definitely kind of has a, you're not sure if that's just the color of the hose or if there's something kind of glowy going on there. Now this is a point at any build that I'm doing that I start getting all the parts on, and I just start looking at what needs adjusting. And I'll have all of the various weathering and painting bottles that I've used throughout the process sitting by off camera. You don't see it, but the desk over this way is a mess. But I've got everything I need right here. I've got my palette right here, and what I do is I just look around the model and look for anything where I want to add some chips, add some rust, touch up the paint, do anything like that, and just get the final touches done. And then I still need to glue in the jet exhausts and the engine exhausts to get it pretty much complete. Well, I've got everything glued on, and I think I'm ready to call this guy done. I am really, really loving these Warhammer kits, and this one is absolutely no exception. It's just a fun, simple build. There's nothing dramatic about it. It's not the coolest vehicle in the world. It's not the one with the biggest weapons or any of those other things, but it's just such a fun kit with so many little details to paint. So much weathering that you can do. I mean, I know I sound like a broken record, but I really do love building and painting and weathering these Warhammer kits. They're just so much fun. If you've not tried one, go pick one up. just look for something that looks cool to you. Don't worry about playing the game. Don't worry about which faction it's from or why it's colored the way it is, or anything about it. Don't worry about any of that. Just go and look on the shelf at your local Warhammer store, or go to their website and just look for something cool. And when you see one you like, get it and build it and paint it and weather it, and you will really, really enjoy it. Because I know when I first got into building these, I built it just to kind of see what it was all about. And I thought it was, okay, it's some tabletop game stuff. But man, these are some fun kits. And this one certainly has been. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm grateful for that, and especially if you're still hanging around at this point of the video. I always appreciate the folks who hang around till the very end. If you have not already done so, please subscribe. There's a link down here in the bottom right. Please subscribe to this channel. I would be most grateful, and hit the little bell icon so you'll know when I have new videos out. There's also links down below to social media and to my blog. I would love it if you'd connect with me on there. I always love hearing from folks. And of course, I have a Patreon account, and there's a link down there to Patreon. It's what supports this channel and supports the website and the blog and everything else that I do, getting the kits, the paint, supplies, all the things I need to do to keep going. So it's not only a blessing for me, but it's for my whole family, because we wouldn't be able to afford for me to do this otherwise. And I really am grateful for the opportunity to be able to do this. If you are already a patron, thank you so much for the support that you give me, and you really do make this possible. So thank you so much for your support. And finally, as I always like to do, I'll leave you one thought in closing. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.